Okay, so today's lesson is about samples and surveys. And this is Chapter 11, Lesson 7. Our objective today is to identify sampling methods and to recognize bias in samples and surveys. So I've got the timer set for 3 minutes. I'll start it in a second here. But your bell activity is to write this in your math journal, but you will be turning it in. So you will be creating this on a separate sheet of paper as well. Okay? So I'm asking you, have you ever been approached to do a survey, like in a mall, or usually with students it's in the mall. You get approached by somebody, they're holding a clipboard and a pencil, and they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. And I say, if you have been approached, what was it over and how did it work? So I want you to do this in your math journal. So after you finish that, then I want you to create a question to survey to your classmates. Okay? And this is the one that you'll be turning in. So do it in pencil because you may need to change it by the end of the hour. It says make sure it has responses and answers to choose from. Responses or answers to choose from. For example, what color are your eyes? Brown, blue, hazel, green. Like check one. You could also do one like, what is your favorite Jolly Rancher? What's your favorite flavor of Jolly Rancher? It doesn't matter what question you choose, but this is what you're going to run an actual survey, and we're going to turn it in. So this you would do on a separate sheet of paper. Okay. All right, I'm going to set the timer for 3 minutes and begin now. About 40 seconds. $20. Okay? So let's put this aside for right now. We'll revisit it at the end of the lesson, and let's move forward. Today we're going to talk about surveys. And first, before we do a survey, we have to learn what types of surveys are there and how do we perform them. What's a good survey? What's a bad survey? What makes it biased or unbiased? A population is all the members of a set. A sample is part of a population. If you determine a sample carefully, it can give a good estimate of the total population. Okay, so you could say Oklahoma might be a sample of the U.S. population. Okay, or all the females in the United States is a sample of the United States population. There's so many, it's unlimited as to what we can do. Right? The essential understanding here is you can get good statistical information about a population by studying a sample of the population. Suppose you want to know what % of all voters in your city favor a tax increase to pay for school improvements. It likely would be impossible to ask an opinion of every single voter. So instead, you select a sample of the voters to estimate the percentage who favor this idea. So you want to have a good sample to be accurate on the actual vote, right? So you can determine different sample types by the methods used to select them. So this is what we're going to talk about now, is what kind of methods can we use? So here's our sampling types and methods. So it says for a convenience sample, select any members of the population who are conveniently and readily available. Just convenience. Okay. Self-selected sample is selecting only members of the population who volunteer for the sample. Self-selected, volunteers. For a systematic sample, order the population in some way, then select from it at regular intervals. In a random sample, all members of the population are equally likely to be chosen. So these are the 4 we're going to focus on. Excuse me. Samples vary in how well they reflect the population. A sample has bias when part of a population is overrepresented or underrepresented. A bias is a systematic error introduced by the sampling method. So sometimes just the way you write a question or ask a question can create great bias in your survey, and you don't want bias. So the first problem we're going to look at is about analyzing the sampling methods. In public opinion, a newspaper wants to find out what % of the city's population favors a property tax increase to raise money for local parks. What is the sampling method used for each situation? Does the sample have bias? Explain. So the first one they give us, a newspaper article on the tax increase invites readers to call the paper and express their opinions. So what type of sample is this? Yes. Self-selected, because people are just selecting to call in. Does this have bias? How could it be biased?
Property taxes for like when you own a house. Well, I mean, it's a little biased to everybody who owns a house.
I can see what you're saying there, but it is about the property tax, so it would just have interest to those homeowners. So what if the article had a title like, it would depend on the title or the way that the article was written. If it was like, down with taxes, and then it's going to get everybody who's, down on taxes reading that article. It could have bias, but we're not certain. But just as they write it, there's no bias. it says this is self-selected. It might have bias depending on who calls the newspaper. The people who call may overrepresent or underrepresent. For example, maybe just it might have been something that caught the attention of all the homeowners who don't want an increase, right? So, for example, some property owners who are against the tax might organize a campaign to get friends and neighbors to call in. That could cause bias too. It's like go out there on Facebook and shoot a nasty article, call in and vote no. You know, they could do that. That could create bias. Okay, the second one, a reporter interviews people leaving the city's largest park. So what kind of sample is that? You will want to look back. He's just getting the people leaving the park. Convenient sample. Select any members of the population who are conveniently and readily available. He just stands at the park and gets all the people walking to their cars, right? So we don't know if it has bias. We don't even know what it's about. They're interviewing people. Well, about what? So we don't know if there's bias. I guess it could. If it was an issue on support the parks, it would be biased because he's standing there at the park. He's going to have all park supporters, right? So it could have bias based on what the question was. So it's a convenient sample since it's convenient for the reporter to stay in one place. Because the location is near a park, the sample may overrepresent park supporters and the results would have bias. So, oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the first question. I forgot about what this is over. All these questions go with this first blurb. So the original question was they want to find out what percent of the city's population favors a property tax increase to raise money for local parks. So yes, being that he's standing at a park, it would absolutely have bias because you're going to want people who's supporting the parks. That's what you would have. So it would have bias. Sorry, I forgot to connect the two. C, a survey service calls every 50th listing from the local phone book. What kind of survey is this? Systematic. Very good. Order the population in some way, then select it at regular intervals. Well, back in the day, you don't see these hardly anymore, but they still exist. There was a phone book that would come out every year that would have everybody in the city of Tulsa in it and surrounding areas. Now it's yellow books, but that's businesses. In the phone book, you would have white pages and yellow pages. Yellow pages were businesses. White pages were all the residents. So if as soon as you got a phone or teenagers got their phone, actually when we had a teenager line in our house, this is before cell phones, it would list the parent's name and address and their telephone number, and then they wouldn't write the children's names. They would just put teenager phone, and they put the teenager phone number. But you can see how with the privacy level, privacy issues now, that would be a big problem in these days. You don't want your numbers listed anywhere. But that's when all these survey people would just cut the phone book up and draw randomly and, do all these surveys like that. Or they would just, like they say, take every 50th listing and start calling at regular intervals. So they're ordered alphabetically and they're taking every 50th listing. So that's a systematic sample. It says it's systematic because the phone book listing is ordered alphabetically. The regular sampling interval is every 50 listings. The sample may have bias if there's some link between the people who are listed. So there were different types of phone books. You could have the Farmers of Coweta phone book. So, in that respect, it could have bias depending on what type of phone book you have. Okay. Any questions over these? Okay, rip out your 11.7 because we're going to finish this and turn it in before the end of the hour. So look at number 1. It says identify the sampling methods used in each of the following situations. Then state whether the sampling method has any bias. So number 1 says a television station invites viewers to call in and name their favorite show. So what is that? Self-selected because they're asking you to call in. Does it have bias? Could it have bias?
Yeah.
How?
'Cause well, it depends on if they're asking for their favorite game show off of that channel or not.
Yes. Like, what if it's Jeopardy and they're asking you what's your favorite game show? Or do you like game shows? But it says name their favorite show. So it could have bias just depending on what type of program it is. Okay, number 2, a school principal gathers an alphabetical list of all the students at the school. Then he selects every 15th student to take a survey about the cafeteria's lunch menu. So what kind of sample is that? Okay, would it have bias? No, it would be probably the best way to do a cafeteria sample at that school. All right, number 3, a reporter asks people leaving a movie theater to take a survey about their television viewing habits. So what kind of sample is this? Convenience. And would it have bias? It could, because they're asking people how they view television. And of course, all the moviegoers are going to love movies. They're there watching movies, so it would have some bias, because people who don't like movies are not going to be represented. All right, any questions over those? Okay, let's look at the next one. A psychologist uses a computer program to randomly select names from a list of... Hey, it won't let me move anything. There we go. List of students at a university. The members of the sample will take a survey about the student housing at the university. So I want you guys to do this one on your own and tell me if it has bias or not. Just a yes or no. Has bias or no bias. Okay. And then I want you to answer number 5. Well, actually, let's go ahead and look at 4 together, since I already sort of showed it. So, what do you think this is? Random sample. Does it have bias? No bias. Okay. Now, the last one, I do want you to do this one on your own. I'll go ahead and read it. A group of television producers plans to survey 10-year-olds to determine their opinions about a new cartoon. Describe a sampling method that could be used to gather a biased sample in the situation. Then describe a method to gather unbiased sample. So show a question that would be biased and show a question that would be unbiased. Okay, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Oh, and is there anybody who doesn't have the study guide? I keep forgetting to pass it out in here. Okay. I'll just come around. As I come around, just raise your hand. Right. But several people have gotten it. I remember at the end of the hour. Do you have one? This is for your text. changes in them. You have one? Do you guys do you have one? Everybody have their study guide now? I know a few of you, your friends had gotten them in other classes and were asking me, hey, did you use study guides? And I forget every time because you guys just hit the ground running. Okay. All right, so I'll give you my example. What did I write? So I put stand outside a toy store and ask. Said that would be biased. How is it biased? That you're standing right outside a toy store. Of course they're all going to like toys, right? So that would be biased. It wouldn't include people who aren't out there buying toys that might have an opinion about it. And then one that is unbiased, just sample all the elementary schools across the nation, right? That would be unbiased. In sampling, that random sampling is the best type with the least bias. Okay, so now we're going to move on to study methods. We talked about surveys. Surveys is one type of study method. So you could do surveys, but there's other things you can do besides a survey. You can run a controlled experiment with a control group, right? And you can run an observational study where you just sit back like Jane Goodall sat back and watched apes and chimpanzees for years and did amazing research work. So there's these three things together that make up our study methods. So in an observational study, you measure and observe members of a sample in such a way that they are not affected by your study. So you just sit back and watch, right? And observe, take notes. In a controlled experiment, you divide the sample into two groups. You impose treatment on one group, but not the other, and the other one is your control group. Then you compare the effect on the treated group of the control group. And those of you who have taken biology or physical science, all that, you've done these experiments. In a survey, these are the things that we were talking about previously on the first page. You ask every member of a sample a set of questions. So, observational study, controlled experiment, or surveys. Now, let's look at number 6, the multiple choice on your homework. A school psychologist sits in a school cafeteria and takes notes on students' behavior while they eat lunch. Which of the following types of studies is the researcher conducting? Controlled experiment, observational study, or survey? Observational study, that's correct. All right, so make sure you circle that. Any questions? I know I'm going a little fast, but I think is the pace okay? All right. Number 7, this is an open-ended question. Again, it says your classmate is randomly selecting a sample of students at his high school to take a survey. You say that your classmate's sample is biased because it only contains high school students. In what case might you be wrong? In what case might you be wrong? So a few seconds here. Anybody want to answer that for me? Yes?
If the question only has to do with high school students.
Absolutely. If the question is just about high school students and that's all you need are the high school students, then they're doing the right thing, right? So you can't say that would be a biased thing. All right, any questions on that? Okay, flip it over on the back. Make sure you're filling this in as we go. Now let's talk about bias. Bias is bad. We do not want bias in our surveys. So a poorly written survey question can introduce bias. A survey question should be clear, precise, and fair, so that everyone hears the same question. It should avoid these things: combining two issues in the same question, using double negatives, overlapping answer choices, Words that cause strong reactions, that's called a loaded question. And you will hear a lot of this in the courtroom. They'll go, objection, Your Honor, that's a loaded question. Or the most common one, you're leading the witness. Objection, you're leading the witness. So suggesting that you want a particular answer, a leading question. So combining two issues, double negatives, overlapping, causing strong reactions, it's a loaded question, or a leading question. So now let's look at how we use these with our assignment. Analyzing survey questions. Is there any bias in the survey question, and explain? The first one says, do you think farmers should use poison to control insects on crops? So is that biased? What word causes it to be biased? The poison. I highlighted it too. So yeah, poison. What could they use that's less offensive? Treatment, insecticide, but still being sort of organic era that we're in. Insecticide is really a bad word. When this book was written, not as bad as poison. But they're saying use pesticide instead of poison. But poison might cause people to respond very negatively as opposed to bug spray or something else. Any questions on that? So do you see how that could cause bias? Okay, here's the next one. Don't you agree that most child care workers are underpaid? Is that biased? And what is that don't you agree? What is that? Leading. You're leading. You're telling them their answer. You're telling them what you want them to say. That's leading. Isn't it true that on the night of February 10th, she murdered the person? You know, you're leading. So you don't want to encourage the person what to say. Now, what could be not biased is saying, are child care workers underpaid? Do you believe child care workers are underpaid? But not, don't you agree? Because you're trying to tell them you need to agree. Okay, the next one. Do you think teachers should communicate frequently with students and their parents about class grades? So, biased? No. Let's look back at, how about the issues? Are there two issues here? Communicate with students and their parents? That's sort of two issues. So, teachers communicating with students and teachers communicating with parents. So that creates bias in the fact that you could be underrepresented in one or the other. So you want to keep those separate issues. Either ask about the students or ask about the parents, but not both. And you could do like a checkbox. Should teachers communicate with, and then checkbox students, checkbox parents. So they could check one, the other, or both. Any questions on that? All right, we're moving right along. Look at your back page. Number 8, identify and describe the bias in the following survey questions. Isn't summer a much more pleasant season than winter? Is that biased? And what is it? Leading. It is leading. Definitely leading. Okay. You're leading because you're telling them, isn't summer? You want them to say, yes, it is. So you can make that unbiased by saying which season is more pleasant, and then checkbox winter, checkbox summer. Or you could just ask, which is summer or winter? I don't know. I do the checkbox. Okay, number 9. Are college students better, and it should stay better off, OFF, mine said better of, but it's better off studying useful subjects such as math or impractical subjects such as art history? So, what kind of bias is that? It's loaded with these useful words and impractical words, because you're telling them, hey, this is useful, math is useful, and art history is impractical. You can't put thoughts into people's head in a survey. You've got to let them decide if it's useful or impractical. I seem to think art history is very important and definitely not impractical. Art history, I wish everybody would have to take, but definitely a loaded question. Those adjectives are just nasty in a survey. All right, do you believe that this year's class field trip was fun and educational? Combined, because you're asking them, was it fun? It could have been just fun but not educational, and it could have been educational and not fun. But they're saying fun and educational, so it is combining two things. You've got to break it down. It could be a checkbox. Was this year's class field trip was checkbox fun, checkbox educational. Check one, or both. So it combines two issues. Do you agree that Mrs. Regis's class is more interesting than Mr. Wright's class? Leading. Yes, you guys are going to make great lawyers. Leading, Your Honor. All right. Any questions on those? All right. Oh, we're doing good. Let's see. We've got 14 minutes. Okay, let's look at designing a survey now. And you should be through number 11, and we'll work the last 3, and we're not going to do 15. We're going to work on our sample instead. All right, designing a survey. During the 2008 Olympic Games, a U.S. swimmer won more gold medals than any other Olympic swimmer than ever before. Now, remember, this is a very old book, right? They're talking about 2008. What sampling method could you use to find the percent of students in your school who recognize the swimmer from a photograph? What is an example of a survey question that is likely to yield information that has no bias? So you want to know how many people at your school recognize the swimmer. What kind of survey could you use? And we know the best one is systematic, right? To get them in some particular order and get them at intervals. So you want no bias. So how could you find out if they recognize the swimmer or not? Would this have bias? Do you recognize this Olympian? Would that have bias? Yeah, because you're telling them already, oh, it's an Olympian. And then they go, oh, yeah, Phelps, whatever. Excuse me. So you want to take that out. You would just want to hold it up and go, do you recognize this person? And show them maybe swimming. Or do you recognize this swimmer? So a possible sampling method would be to stand at the school door and question every 10th student entering the school. That would be a nice selection representing all the kids in your school, right? Systematic sampling. It usually also contains the least bias. A possible unbiased survey question is, who's pictured in this photograph? So you don't even want to say swimmer, because swimmer tells them it's a swimmer. But if it's a picture of him swimming, it would be a little obvious. So depending on what kind of photograph, you know, who's pictured in the photograph? There's nothing there that suggests anything, except who suggests it's a person, which, hello, is a person. And photograph, well, you're looking at a photograph. So there's nothing there that gives you any clue about who it is or what they do. Any questions on that? All right, so look at number 12. So rewrite the following survey questions so they are no longer biased. So number 12 on your homework says, do you prefer the excitement of rock and roll or the tediousness of classical music? So we know it's biased. What kind of question is it? It's loaded because you're using those adjectives to describe rock and roll and classical music. I tend to think some classical music's very exciting myself. And I think some rock and roll is very tedious. You know, listen to Eddie Van Halen. That's tedious guitar playing, but good. All right. But they are loaded because they're already giving you an idea of what to think. So how can you rewrite that? So
Would you like, do you prefer the sound of rock or
yeah, that's how exactly what I did. Which music do you prefer? And then check one or both, rock and roll, classical. Good. Ashton, you're on fire, baby. She on fire. Okay, 13. Would you agree that dogs make better pets than cats? What is that? Leading. You guys are killing this. Good job. All right, so how would you rewrite that question?
What's a better pet and like the pet
Uh-huh. Which is the better pet, or which pet is your favorite? Dog, cat? Okay, and 14 I want you to do on your own, okay? And I'll look over that one when you turn them in. It says, do you believe that Mayor Johnson is friendly and effective? So what can we say, what is the bias in this? Two issues, yes. They're asking, is he friendly and is he effective? So rewrite that question, and then we're done with the assignment. Yay! Don't you wish they were all like that? Okay, then I want you to go back to your survey question and ask 10, well, see if you need to rewrite it and remove any bias. Make sure it's a good question now that we know how to survey. And conduct your survey to 12 people in the classroom. Okay, tally and state your results. We won't have time to present, but we will turn it in. So if you don't finish in class, you can turn it in first thing tomorrow, but you'll have to get 12 people throughout the day to take your survey, okay? And I don't expect, 12 sheets to show the results. You're going to ask and just take a tally, right? Okay, so that's everything, guys. Thank you for working so hard and being amazing, and this concludes our lesson. Are there any questions before I stop the video? All right, thank you. This concludes our lesson.